Culture and reading are two sides of one coin, knowledge. Sometimes knowledge has a third side, which is travel. In the past it was said that travel has 7 benefits, one of which is knowledge of the world around us and changes that constantly occur, be they economic, cultural, or social. Travel, whether through a profession, a study, or scientific research, is a means of knowledge and learning the habits of other peoples. One of those who adopt this approach to life is our guest today, Dr. Ayman Zohry, population expert and president of the Egyptian Society for Migration Studies. Dr. Ayman Zohry received a Bachelor of Business Administration degree from Helwan University in 1985. He then obtained a diploma in population studies from the Demographic Center in Cairo in 1992, and another diploma from the same center in 1993 on population and development. This was followed by a master's degree in 1995 on population studies, and then a PhD degree in 2003 on migration studies from the University of Sussex. Dr. Zohry is fluent in both English and French, in addition to his mother tongue, of course, Arabic. He practiced research, teaching, and executive work at the National Population Council, the Demographic Center in Cairo, the American universities in Cairo and Beirut, and the Danish Center for International Studies in Copenhagen. He also worked as an advisor in several areas related to patterns of migration, be they from one state to another or within the same state. He visited many countries around the world and has a number of writings about the countries he's been to, of course in addition to one fiction conveying his affection by illegal immigration and the resulting harm to individuals and the society in which they live.
I grew up in an Egyptian village in Sohag Governorate. It is located between the Nile and the Eastern Mountain. And in this atmosphere, actually, reading is not so supported, and illiteracy rates were so high. But fortunately, my parents were educated. My father was working as a teacher at that time. My mother, despite of her education, she was a housewife taking care of the family. So reading was not so important in this society. But in fact, I started my reading beyond the curriculum of the school by reading magazines for children, very common at that time, and still now my kids are reading the same magazines. I started reading Miki and Samir, the most famous 2 magazines, in addition to other magazines for children like 1010. It was so difficult to bring the magazines and the newspapers to my village because at that time it was remote. It was 19 kilometers far from Sohag, the capital. And actually my father used to visit the capital every week, and the gift that I was always waiting for when he comes back from the city center or Sohag city, were the magazines of Miki and Samir, in addition to 1010. Also, I started reading newspapers very early, in maybe I remember in grade 5 or grade 6 in primary. And at that time, actually, there were no newsstand in my village. And newspapers used to arrive very late, sometimes at 12 noon, to the center of the governorate, the capital of the governorate. I remember the train that used to bring the newspapers is called the press train, because they carry out the newspapers on it, and it was common to buy newspapers at 12 noon. Because of that, newspapers were so valuable, not like today, and the issues were so few newspapers. I remember 3 newspapers, daily newspapers, morning and Al-Misa in the afternoon, so only 4 newspapers. And as that, I remember that having a newspaper means that you have a very valuable thing that in many times we stay 3-4 days reading the one issue of a daily newspaper. After primary school, we moved to Libya with the family because my father was seconded as a teacher in the Ministry of Education in Libya. And we stayed there for 3 years in not a village like my village in Upper Egypt, but in a urban center where newspaper stands were available. And also this was in the beginning of the revolution era in Libya, so there were public libraries. And at that time, I remember I used to go to the public library almost every day after school. And in addition to the public library in the school, I have had the chance to buy more newspapers coming from Lebanon, coming from Tunisia at that time. So this made available for me a lot of resources to read. Also, books were subsidized at that time, so newspapers, books were almost available for everyone in Libya at that time. I believe that this was a very good experience for me to be exposed to also to other Arab cultures, not only the magazines of Egypt that are issued by Dar al-Hilal at that time, but also magazines and books that are issued by press firms in Lebanon, in Tunisia, and in many other places in the Arab country. We returned back, we returned from Libya after 3 years spent there, and the family moved to live in Cairo. We were living in Saida Zainab, very close to the Dar al-Kutub, the main public library in Egypt. And it was within a walkable distance between my home in Saida Zainab and Bab al-Khalq, where the main public library is still based there. So this made available for me a lot of resources. I started to read sophisticated books and so on. One of the books I can just grab a very important book, maybe to me, as a researcher on population and migration studies. This book actually is the oldest book in my library. It was printed in 36, sorry, and it was written by a scholar in the American University in Cairo at that time, 1933. His name was Wendell Cleland, and he was talking about the population problem in Egypt. So more than 70 years ago, there were researchers who were interested in studying overpopulation problem in Egypt. Unfortunately, we still suffer the same problem since 1930s till now, more than 70 years. Also, this book shed some light about the habits of Egyptians with respect to migration. This is also my favorite specialization. In this book, Wendell Cleland mentioned clearly that Egyptians don't migrate. Now we have more than 5 million Egyptians abroad, but in this book, Wendell Cleland said that Egyptians don't migrate, and if they migrate, they just migrate for tourism or to study, and then they return. After 70 years, I believe that the words of Wendell Cleland are still valid, or at least partially valid, because most of Egyptians who migrate abroad, they return. And even if they didn't manage to fulfill their desires to return, they keep saying that they will return, and they keep dreaming of return. This is about this book. Also, maybe because I grew up in a small village, or in a village in Upper Egypt, I always like the history of Upper Egypt, the history of villages, the social history of the Egyptian society. So one of my favorite books, which I feel proud that I have it in my library, is this book, Growing Up in an Egyptian Village, by Professor Hamid Ammar. This was issued, I remember, I think in 1949, more than almost about 60 years, and this was part of, or the a new version of the thesis of Dr. Hamid Ammar when he was studying in London at that time. And in fact, despite the fact that this was written very early, about 20 years before my birth or 15 years before my birth, still the findings that he mentioned in the book, like in the social life in the village, was the same as the social life in the village I grew up in Upper Egypt 30 years ago, which means that the change that happened in the Egyptian village occurred after the 1975, after the massive migration of Egyptians to the Gulf and the change of consumption habits and social relations. Another book in my library, which is quite different than studying the social history of Egypt, is the book about Sheikh Rashid Rida. He was one of the followers of Muhammad Abdu, Imam Muhammad Abdu, and this book was written by Gamal al-Banna, shows how the followers of Muhammad Abdu wanted to convey the same message to the public, but actually the experience of Rashid Rida is not exactly a successful example of conveying the message of Rashid Rida, of Muhammad Abdu. Also, because of my specialization in migration studies, I always like to study the minorities and migration to Egypt, because if we now, Egypt is a sending country, that a country that sends migrants abroad, even to the Arab countries in the Gulf, or to the West, like the Egyptians who are living in the States and Europe. But Egypt was composed of different layers of migration, from as the time of the pharaohs till the time of the invasion of Egypt by many different cultures and citizenships. This book is one of the books that show how foreigners contributed to the development of Egypt. So Egypt was, before the Egyptian Revolution, Egypt was a receiving country, and actually, in fact, the Egyptian Revolution and the Egyptian Renaissance was the outcome of the interaction between Egyptians and foreigners. And this book is one of them. This shows how the people who come from what we call in Arabic al-Sham, which is composed of Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, they contributed to the development of Egypt through being active participants in social life in Egypt in the last 2 centuries. In fact, reading at my time, or at the time of my study in the secondary school or university or afterward, was easier than today's world, because reading was the main cultural thing you do. But now you have many other options. You have the internet, you have even the kids now, they have the PlayStation, the Nintendo double screen, they have the video games, other things that make them not more likely to read books or newspapers. And the pace of the life also, the pace of the life now became more faster than before. I remember also when I was in the school or in the university, there were no pressure from the family on me to study, because this was a sort of a self-commitment. No one says, oh, you should study 5 hours, 6 hours. There were no, the prevalence of private tutoring was not so widespread like now, so there were always time to read. to the extent that sometimes I remember when I was in the school or in the university, when I like a curriculum, a syllabus, or a book, I remember that I read it at a time, one shot in the beginning of the schooling year, instead of just following up after the teacher. I don't think that my kids are doing so now. They are studying just because they have to study, and they devote more time to the technology, internet, Game Boy, and the likes. Like all other colleagues at that time, or like all other Egyptians at that time, there were sort of interest on reading literature, reading fictions. I started reading fictions and the novels of Naguib Mahfouz, Ihsan Abdul Quddus, Yusuf Idris, and Yusuf Sibai also early in my life. I remember in the first year of secondary school, I started reading the sets of novels of Ihsan Abdul Quddus and others. Till now, I keep the habit of reading fictions, novels, and one of them actually it's related also to my specialization in migration. It is written by Tayyib Saleh, the Sudanese novelist, the late Sudanese novelist Tayyib Saleh. It is رحلة الهجرة إلى الشمال, the season of migration to the north. Also, I read the Upper Egypt Train by Yusuf Al-Qaid. This is one of the novels I read in the last few years, and also it's unbelievable. Muhammad Abdul Halim Abdullah, maybe he is not well known like Naguib Mahfouz and others, but Muhammad Abdul Halim Abdullah is my favorite novelist. His style is so fantastic, and actually this novel, شجرة اللبلاب, is full of perfect style, emotions, very nice experience. In addition to this, and despite the fact that I'm living in Cairo, I'm still very connected to Upper Egypt. So I'm still reading on Upper Egypt identity and change, because in fact this change I see at myself in my visits to Upper Egypt, from a very peasant society to a very mixed society, the same as the slum areas surrounding Cairo. Another book I have read is The Culture of Egyptians by Fuad Qandil. I still feel that I need to understand more and more the culture of our country. In fact, there are two books that affected my life in a very early stage in my life. The first book was written by President Sadat, Search of Identity, or Al-Bahth an al-Zat. And the other book was My Life, or Hayati, by Ahmad Amin. I read these two books when I was in secondary school in about in early 1980s. The first book by Sadat affected my life in a sort of, I feel that also politicians can write something for the people. So it's not only the achievements of Sadat in the political arena, but also I discovered that Sadat is a perfect writer in this book. The second book, My Life, by Ahmad Amin. Ahmad Amin is a very well-known scholar in Islamic history, and he has a lot of books, but he was talking about his life, especially in the beginning, or describing the suffer that he passed through in his life, and also the migration from Beira to Cairo, and the migration when he described in this book when he was appointed as an employee in Tanta, and his family was living in Cairo at that time, and how Tanta was so far, to the extent that he was sending to them written letters from Tanta to Cairo. Now many people are commuting between Cairo and Tanta. That's going every day to their work in Tanta or going every day to their work in Cairo. When I was in the school, English language at that time was not like today's world. I started studying English when I was in grade 7, which is first primary in Egypt. So I was not exposed to the readings of English or other language earlier, like my kids, for instance, now. But when I started working in the field of population, migration, and other social science fields, I felt that I have to master English language, which was happened actually a few years after my graduation from the university, joining work as a researcher in the National Population Council of Egypt. Then I moved to the Cairo Demographic Center as a researcher. I worked as a visiting professor in the American University of Beirut and in the American University in Cairo. I worked as a visiting researcher in the Research Center on Migration in the University of Sussex in England. Then I worked also as a visiting senior researcher in the Danish Institute of International Studies. My exposure to the other culture, my exposure to other languages and lifestyles affected my readings and made me more eager to read and more able also to read about other cultures, other nationalities, and in other languages. As an example of this, the book. This book is a very important book in the study of human mobility. It's called The Age of Migration, and it talks about the widespread of the phenomenon of migration and how people migrate and why, and the main migration streams worldwide. The other book, which is actually not related to migration, but it is related to a nation that made by migrants. It talks about the United States of America, and the book by Farid Zakaria. It is about, it's called The Post-American World, and he talks about the competition that America faces from other growing powers in Southeast Asia, in Southern America, like Brazil, like India and China. Also, I'm still reading about the races and ethnicities in Egypt, and especially I have a special interest on Armenians in Egypt because of their contribution to the social and to the economic life of the country. This is a very important book on Armenians in Egypt, written by Dr. Muhammad Rifat Al-Imam. In fact, when I started working in the field of population and migration, and because of the connection of these topics to the international research agenda, most of my publications were in forms of research papers and conference presentations, and most of them were in English language. In 2005, I felt that I have a commitment towards my country, towards the people of my country, so that I thought of writing something in Arabic for the non-specialized people. And in 2006, 7 and 8, every year I made a commitment to write a light book that is directed to the general, to the public readers who are not specialized in my specialization on population studies or migration studies. The first book I issued in 2006 is called دفتر أحوال المجتمع المصري. or insights into Egyptian society, where I describe the change that happened in the Egyptian society due to the change, the very speed change in the technology, especially the technology of communications, and how it affected the relations between population with different other topics related to the Egyptian society. It is a group of 20 articles. Most of them were published in newspapers and journals a few years ago. This book was issued in 2007. It is the التجربة الدنماركية, or the Danish experience. Actually, this is not Adil Imam's experience, but this is really my experience. When I was in Denmark, I was working as a visiting researcher in the Danish Institute for International Studies in Copenhagen, and I have documented in this book the livelihoods and the lives of Arabs in Copenhagen, like Iraqis and Somalis in Copenhagen, and also the point of view of the Danish people and the Danish society about Muslims and Islam and Islamic societies. The third book is actually, sometimes I feel that it's out of context, simply because this is a novel, a fiction. It is, but I feel very proud of it, because this is the first Egyptian novel on irregular migration, and it describes the painful experience of Saber, who dreams of the European El Dorado, and he wants to migrate to Italy to make money, and it ended up that he was arrested and returned to Egypt. Work is not everything in my life. Work is very important, but it's not everything. The family is very important to me. I spend a lot of time with the family. Also, I have other interests. For example, I like to listen to music, but not classical music like in the West, for instance. I like actually folkloric music, Sufi music. I like Yasin al-Tuhami and the other Mulawiya music. Belongs to Maulana Jalaluddin al-Rumi. I like also the Turkish Nile and the Egyptian Nile. This is about music. I also like walking, but not walking as a sport. Actually, I don't practice a lot. I like walking in the Fatimite Cairo, in the area between Gamaliya, in Al Hussein, in Al Ghuriyya, in the citadel area, just seeing the architecture of the different Islamic eras, like Mamalik, like Ottomans, and so on. These are my other interests. In addition, of course, to technology, I'm very interested in technology. I developed my own website. I like web development. I like digital photography. I developed the websites of my colleagues and friends also. So I feel that I closely connected to technology, but I don't addict it like my kids, for instance. My advice, or sometimes advice, people don't like to be advised, especially the young people and kids. But I'd like to draw their attention that the book will remain. So don't listen to those who say that the book will disappear, the newspapers will disappear. The book will remain. But at the same time, you are not obliged to read books. If you don't want or you don't like to read books, or the hard copy books that are common that were common in my time, or and still till now. If you want to read from the computer screen, read from the computer screen. If you don't want even to read at all, you can just watch documentary films. You can see the cinema. The cinema is show the history of the whole world. So if you don't like reading, don't force yourself to read. There are other means to be aware of what's going on. But to me, to myself, the smell of the books makes a difference to me.